How is everybody doing? And welcome back for another Strength Chat episode. Today, I've got a very special guest here. He's actually a returning guest to Strength Chat. He's the co-founder and lead nutritionist at Reformance Training. Today, I'm joined by the one and only Kedric Kwan. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. Thank you, Steve, for having me again. It's always a pleasure to come back and just talk about all things strength training, nutrition, and fun stuff, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, since we last spoke, quite a while ago now. But how are you? What have you been up to? What's kind of been happening in your world?
Yeah, so I mean it's been quite a while. I mean, I think the last time we spoke, I was still part of the strength guys.
Yeah.
So now you mentioned that I'm kind of like the co-founder alongside my other co-founder, Alfred Jong, who was also formerly part of the strength guys. We started Reformance Training, and that has been ongoing for slightly more than 1.5 years. Uh, it has been pretty successful. Yeah, we're really thankful how that's going along. Of course, still working on my PhD, almost nearing the end, right? So coming close to completion. And this year, the two big meets that I was involved in was number one, obviously Sheffield 2023, and of the recent IPF Worlds in Malta. And I'm not sure when this episode will be released, but I will also be in Junior Worlds, IPF Junior Worlds in
Ah,
Romania,
nice.
and that's in 4 weeks. So lots and lots of traveling, right? All of them are kind of like in Europe. So the past 6 months, there's I basically took I've been back and forth to the UK/Europe for up to 3 times in the past 6 months, and
Wow.
each trip is like 30 hours. So lots of flying.
Yeah, and how have you got on with that? Because obviously, I mean, don't get me wrong. Obviously I was at I saw Sheffield. Obviously, didn't get a chance to get over to Malta. But how was that? Because obviously, I can imagine it's quite tiring when you're actually at the competitions. How have you kind of balanced that with um your coaching and your PhD and all those sorts of things? How have you kind of got on with that over the last couple of months?
Yeah, so I mean the traveling is of course yeah, it's really time consuming, right? There's jet lag and all that kind of stuff. But in general, I think that I I don't know whether I'm fortunate or whether I'm adaptable, right? I don't know which is the case that I don't really get impacted by like time zone change. I mean, I'm glad. I mean, I do feel tired, right? But I'm glad I'm not competing. So in general, a couple of coffees would probably get me going. And just try to not fall sick, which unfortunately didn't happen. I've only fell sick twice the past 2 years, and both times was after Worlds, right? So last year was in South Africa, right? I felt sick after that, and then this year not as bad, right? But I also felt caught a cold like right after the end of Malta. So in general, it's just kind of finding ways to try to eat as well as you can, sleep as well as you can, and juggle a whole bunch of other responsibilities, right? When you're not coaching on the platform, when you're not handling, checking on people's weight, making sure they make weight, you have your other responsibilities as well to your other lifters who are not competing at Worlds, right? So you just kind of have to plan. I think that the big thing for me is just writing like a to-do list, and just you have to get things done on this particular time, especially when you have like a sheer number of people competing at Worlds, right? It's easy for you to just like, oh cool, I've missed this guy's weigh-in, right? Like if you it's when you're so tired, and you definitely don't want that to happen. So like I essentially made a spreadsheet of all the people that I have to like pay attention to, which like what times they weigh in, what days they weigh in. Some of them they're in like the A flight, right? The A group, and some of them is the B group, and because of that, the weigh-in times are different, even though they are in the same weight class, right? Just making sure that you write everything down, right? So you don't. Some people may have poor memory, some people will have better memory than others, but I think when you're tired and when you're busy, right, you just don't want, yeah, you just don't want to uh make a mistake because something slipped your mind. So always good to have reminders.
Yeah, definitely. Because I mean, looking at, I've never been to an international competition, but even for a local competition, you want to make sure everything's right. So times that by 10 with the traveling that you're doing, you need to make sure you're keeping on top of that. With that in mind as well, obviously, looked after or had a good team of lifters at Sheffield. When you mentioned about that, kind of two parts on that. How did you find Sheffield and being involved in that? But then also, in terms of the more so the nutrition strategies going into there. I know not everything was kind of like plain sailing in terms of being able to adjust things. How did you kind of work around that to make sure that the lifters still performed on the day?
Yeah, I think Sheffield was great. I mean, couple of a couple of questions to answer. I think the environment of Sheffield, just being a part, being there was already like a big privilege, right? Hats off to SPD and Pete Spence, who basically ran the whole thing. Sure, there are a couple of like hiccups, right, in terms of the organization, but it's the first event of its kind, right? Uh, mistakes are bound to happen. I think that all in all, the experience was amazing. If Sheffield 2023 is the tipping point of when powerlifting starts to like grow into like a sport that people can envision making a living out of, right? I'm just glad to be part of that, right?
Yeah.
When all the lifters were standing in front of Sheffield Hall, right? Taking the picture, right? I mean, it's nice to say that, it's nice to be here. Who knows
Yeah.
in 2020, I don't know, maybe the year 2100, where people don't use like pictures anymore, right? So you literally have like holographic images, right? And then you just go back every year in Sheffield, right? And then the first ever Sheffield picture from Sheffield Hall, right? It's just a regular photo, right? And then I definitely won't be alive in the year 2100. I'll be it'll be really cool to say like, oh, I was like at that moment, right? That
Yeah.
moment is like uh yeah, it's just something to cherish, right? Obviously working with the lifters as well. It's not new. It's not news anymore who I work with, right? We have Emil Krastev, Evie Corrigan, Taylor Atwood, and Gavin Adian. So I do Emil Krastev's training, right? The other three, I just do the nutrition, right? Obviously, when Emil and I started working together, we didn't really have, we like because of some complications, he got his like wildcard invite late. So um, when we started working together, I didn't know he had neither him nor myself knew that our first competition was going to be Sheffield in like 2.5 months, right? So no pressure, right? First time working with a high level lifter. The first meet is the biggest meet in IPF history. So it wasn't. It's also no longer a secret that he was injured, right? So we just did the best we could. I think that for the nutrition lifters as well, the shocker was obviously Evie Corrigan cutting down to the 52 kilo weight class, all right, and then taking home the overall best female lifter, right? And breaking the world record by the biggest amount of percentage. So I just kind of like am honored to be a part of that journey, right? Guiding her through the nutrition, making sure everything is going well. And like Gavin Aiden, I think he did fantastic as well. Taylor, Taylor is very simple, right? Being there for all these three nutrition lifters, I said essentially I told them this is what you eat, this is what you eat right there, and Emil eat the same thing, right? Unfortunately, Taylor had food poisoning like the day before Sheffield, right? Even though all four of them were eating the same thing, and I mean to a certain extent, all the lifters were eating the same thing, but maybe it's just something just didn't sit well with Taylor's stomach,
Yeah.
and he had food poisoning, right? So obviously Taylor was also going into Sheffield, he was injured, right? So yeah, I think that essentially we think about how, for me as the coach, is that I like to say that I think of situations that may present itself and then think of potential solutions if it pops up, right? So I'm not saying that I'm not trying to be paranoid, right? Obviously, I have like I would say within reason, okay? Like you think of situations within reason. Like I'm not gonna think of what happened if the roof in Taylor's room collapsed on him, right? Things like this, right? That's kind of being slightly towards the more paranoid end, but within reason, if this happens, right, this is what you should go down, right? Obviously, I didn't think about food poisoning, but let's just say if someone has like like a diarrhea, right? So essentially it's kind of like very similar thing, or like someone just like is throwing up or losing. Essentially, food poisoning is a like massive dehydration. So what do you do in situations that if this person's really dehydrated, but now this person potentially may not be able to stomach food as well, because when someone has food poisoning, their gut may be upset. So these are certain situations that may be worth thinking about, and so that when it does pop up, right, I'm not trying to wish that it happens to the lifters that I coach, but when it does pop up, you won't be caught by surprise. Because I think that when it comes to coaches, right, trying to maintain like a really calm and composed temperament is important, because your lifters will be nervous, right, and they might want to draw confidence from you, so even if you may be nervous, I don't think that exhibiting or having a nervous posture would be beneficial for the lifters. And I think that some people can really like detach themselves from their emotions, right? Whereas some people, they cannot, right? So for those that cannot, and we know ourselves better, right? Whether we're more emotional, whether we're a little bit more like stoic or composed, right? We know our temperament better. So if you're the kind that's more emotional, right, you just have to remind yourself, right? Try not to have a nervous posture, or try not to like spread your nervous aura around your lifters who are already nervous. You have to remember that they are competing and not you. So you want to be the one that supports them, right? And if they're nervous, let them draw confidence from you. And I think that thinking ahead and planning for all that can kind of like calm your potential nervousness if a situation that is unforeseen arises. So that was essentially the experience at Sheffield, right? I think that the results out Sheffield, I don't have to recap. People know what the results are. Sheffield basically took place like almost, like you think about it, almost half a year ago, right? So it's pretty crazy. And yeah, that was basically my experience at Sheffield in a nutshell.
Yeah, definitely. I think that was quite good because obviously, with that, from the nutrition side of things, when you mentioned there about planning in advance and trying to take into account things that might go wrong. Obviously, within circumstances, not a roof falling in or anything like that. With that, because obviously you said there about being calm and collected and being able to look after the lifter. How much is sort of is from experience in terms of being able to patch things up if something doesn't go to plan, and how far in advance did you plan the nutrition side of things to make sure that everything was dialed in come competition day?
I think that the most important thing is like there are certain elements that you cannot account for, right? I think that I mean, even from a purely physics perspective, there's always like, oh, okay, cool. People talk about like quantum indeterminacy, right? There's certain things that we cannot account for, right? So I think that you probably have to just come to terms that there are things that you would not, like, no matter how much you think, right, you will not be able to plan for every single situation and every single outcome. Like I wish that I have the eye of Agamemnon, the one that Doctor Strange has. I can see all potential futures that scenarios that play out, right? But there will be things that you would not be able to plan for, and I think that that's fine. I just think that the things that you can control, you control, right? And there are lifters where you speak to, right, certain sometimes when you tell them, okay, I need to plan this 5 months in advance, they will not be able to execute anything 5 months in advance. It's just how they are, right? Perhaps if you work with them long enough, maybe you can kind of like push them a little, right, and say that, hey, maybe we try, instead of 2 months, now we try 3 months, right? And then you just gradually push the boundaries. But I think that every lifter is individual. But there are some lifters where they're like, yeah, I'm a robot, just tell me, I'll just do this, XYZ, I'll do XYZ and I follow. So it really goes down to the individual lifter, and of course the needs of the lifter as well, right? How far are you from making weight? And all these factors would play a huge role, because I do think that there is no one size approach, especially when it comes to nutrition, right? I think that eating habits as well are very, very different among individual, right? Across like biological sexes, right? Males and females, they approach food very differently, and even within the same sex as well, right? The individual variations are also there, right? I something that I notice is that and this is just very general, right? I think that what we see that when I have a consult call, right, with a female lifter, right, and then what they would tend to do before we start coaching. Let's just say we have a consult call and then we decide to say start 10 days later. During that 10 days, a lot of female lifters would just like start tidying things up, so that when they start, they look like, okay, cool, right? Maybe they don't feel as judged, right? It's like cleaning the house before the cleaner comes in, But whereas if it's a guy lifter, before they start during the 10 days, they will just eat everything, They just like make a mess of the room, and then they will ask you to go and clean everything up, So even that, there are differences as such, right? So it is hard to say how long do you plan, but I like to tell the people that I work with, like, because if I work with you for nutrition, right? Even if we look at just general, very, very from very broad sense in terms of the research, right? Let's just say muscle hypertrophy, right? If you're really advanced, right, it's like 0.5% to 1% per month, So that means that on the top end, in 3 months, you gain 3% of, you may gain 3%, right? So 3% of like, if you're 83 kilo lifter, 3% is probably like, like 2 over kilos. Yeah, right. But that is for people who are doing really like specifically providing a stimulus that will provide hypertrophy, right? But if 3 months, right, usually when the lifter peaks, right, they tend to not have volume that's as high, so potentially, right, that may even diminish the rate of hypertrophy. So what I'm trying to say is that you go to 3 months, right, and the gain is so small that you might not even see it, right? So if you want to work with me for 1 month, I say like you probably will not see any gains at all, right? So I say like, if you want to work with me, it's not because I want your money, right? But honestly, the first like 6 weeks, I'm figuring how you respond. I have to see how much you're eating, evaluate your habits, and then see how does that correlate to your training, because you are a powerlifter, which means that if I'm not your powerlifting coach, right, I do powerlifting coaching and nutrition for certain lifters, like Header Corner, I do both, right? But if I'm not, then I would see how you respond to your training, right, based on your communication, either with you telling me how it goes, or if you want to put me in touch with your coach and your coach is willing to have a conversation with me, and both of us have the time to speak about it, right, we can. But like I said, the first 6 months, I'm honestly just learning about you, and then past the 6 months mark, if I just put a change, right, and then let's just say we're trying to gain weight or try to, obviously losing weight is easier, but like I said, I think that 3 months is a good like starting point that will allow me to plan something. Like I have worked with lifters that come to me 6 weeks prior, right, and they just say I want to make weight, and I say that, yep, cool, I'm just gonna throw everything, because you have to lose so much weight, and it's gonna be tough, right? And I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. I work with lifters that have been. They said I'm 8 weeks away from competition. This is what I need. But in general, I said that if you can give me 3 months, that'll be good.
Yeah. And with that, do you think when lifters, because obviously you do hear of, and you probably have worked with lifters, or I've had experience of this as well, is leaving it too late and wanting to drop weight too quickly, and just thinking, oh well, there's strategies out there. Is that because of a lack of education, or maybe a lack of guidance from other coaches that they've maybe worked with to try and patch over it and lose weight too quickly?
Yeah, I think that there is quite a big like I don't want to psychologize people too much, but I think that just the nature of how things are, right? Whether it's social media, whether it's the culture, right? Well, like instant gratification is very, very common. I think that nutrition is different to adhere to, because the reason why I say nutrition is difficult to adhere to, and I use this analogy when I was doing like some work back in the day with a Cardiff City Football Club, right? So Cardiff City Football Club at the time was in the championship league, so the one under the Premier League, right? So obviously, when you're in a lower league, you don't have as much budget. So they didn't really have like a hands-on sports nutritionist, right? So I'm thinking like, yeah, you have like 7 physios, like 4 S&C coaches, but you don't even have a single nutritionist there, right? So I was thinking like, why, right? And then when I was speaking to the players, when I was speaking to the players, like one of the players, he basically just said, "Oh, you're like I was a nutrition intern." He just said, "Oh, you're a physio." He said, like everybody to me is a physio, right? Then it made me think, right? Why would he like? Why does physio stand out to him so much? Then in my head, I'm like, okay, cool, right? The reason why they have, by the way, a lot of football players are also really, really bad in terms of adhering to like anything. They just like, yeah, basically they're not easy to work with. Let's just put it this way. But I think about like why do they recognize like someone as someone being a physio? So immediately I like when they play on the pitch, right? They get the feedback, right, of playing on the pitch. They score a goal, practice, they get almost like instantaneous feedback. When they go to the gym, they do S&C stuff, and let me tell you, a lot of football players, they don't like doing S&C work, but those that does, right, they probably feel like, oh, maybe I'm lifting the weights, right? Maybe I get a little bit sore the next day. Maybe I'm lifting more weights. They get that instant feedback. When they do a physio, let's just say if they run and then they pull the hamstring, or they get like muscle tightness, the physio will give them a massage, right? And then they would feel like, oh, I feel a bit more limber now, right? I'm less tight and less stiff and less sore, right? So they also get an instant feedback from that particular profession. However, when you go to a nutritionist, it's like, oh yeah, cool, like try not to drink so much when you go out on the weekend. I'm like, no, like, and then the things like, oh yeah, I want you to eat better, I want you to eat more vegetables, right? I'm gonna like tell you to do this, right? But the things that whenever you do this, they're not gonna get any like instant feedback, right? The feedback loop is like really long. You see like this extremely long feedback loop, right? Coming back all the way. And I think a lot of people don't make it till the end of the feedback loop. That's why nutrition interventions are so tough, right? And then now you factor in the culture where, oh, everything has to happen really quick. I want this instant gratification, I want this gains. I'm 17 years old, lifting X amount of weight, and there's this person on social media who is like 16 years old lifting like 50 kilos more than me. I want to beat that person, right? So like the nature of nutrition interventions, if you think of plus the culture, right, doesn't really help in terms of people wanting to do things fast. And I think that a lot of it comes to communicating to the lifter, right? I don't doubt the thing with powerlifting is that it's not like groundbreaking. It's not like, like I need to provide X amount of carbohydrates for at this period of time because you're training so hard. I mean, let's face it, powerlifting training, you train for 3 hours in the gym, half the time you're talking. You're not like running for 3 hours straight like a lifter, like an endurance lifter, cyclist, whatever. The fueling strategies for powerlifters are not that complicated, right? But it's kind of like managing their expectations in terms of what they can gain from it within a certain time frame. And I think that in general, speaking to the lifters and telling them that is far, far more important than knowing, oh, right, 1 gram of protein is 4 calories, 1 gram of carbohydrate is 4 calories, and 1 gram of fat is 9 and these are your macros, because like I said, you don't really get the feedback loop is so long for anything nutrition related. And even if you think about it, right, from a supplement perspective, there's almost no supplement, right, out there that gives you an instant benefit except caffeine, So all the one like protein intake, right? You look at the protein intake and the and its correlation with muscle growth, it happens over an extended period of time, right? Even creatine, you need to creatine load, right? The quickest you can get, it's like maybe in 14 days. So you still need that 14 days. You don't really get an instant, like an instant hit except caffeine. And even with caffeine, after taking it for so long, right, taking the same amount, you may still not get that hit again, right? So there really isn't much in terms of nutrition that provides that incentive that rewards people who really, really sort of like seeks out that kind of like instant results. So I think that is the big challenge for a nutrition coach, is how do you navigate that? How do you essentially communicate with your lifters and find ways, right? Find ways to maybe provide an artificial, create some form of feedback loop for them, right? Saying that, how do you feel when you do this? Speak to them, like say like, okay, cool, I want you to be more in tune with this, or you can explain to them why we're doing this, right? I think explaining to them why you're doing something also helps them adhere to something. You empower them to make decisions on themselves, because half the time if you tell them do this, then you will get that in like at least like in a month. What happens if what happens if a situation arises and they are unable to accomplish that? And if you don't give them a reason, you don't empower them to make certain choices that are within, let's say, certain boundaries, right? Then they'll be like, oh crap, I know now I'm falling off the wagon. I feel bad because I cannot adhere to to certain things. And then, like I said, then that feedback loop essentially is like, like you have a disruption in the feedback loop, because let's just say you need to have like execute 5 weeks in a row, right? To see some form of results. But let's just say if they fall off the wagon, right, and then you take that 1 to 2 weeks off, then now you have 7 weeks, right? And then because you have 1 to 2 weeks essentially wasted. But if you can kind of like empower them to do kind of like make decisions that are reasonable, right? Maybe it will not be 7 weeks, maybe it will be 5.5. So that will come quicker, right? And people often talk about motivation, right? I like to say that, at the end of the day, you can't like just pluck motivation from thin air. At the start, you have to be disciplined, right? You need some willpower, discipline to actually do the things that you have to do. When you start seeing the results then motivate you to go further,
Yeah.
So that is essentially my role as a coach, is to say, from now till the results, when the results appear, right, how am I gonna keep you going, right? So that's kind of like I think that is kind of like the more important thing when it comes to nutrition coaching, besides just macronutrients.
Yeah, definitely, because it's interesting what you said there about the feedback loop, because when it comes to training, when it comes to anything like that, you're going to get that immediate feedback in terms of performance. Do you think that that's where, because nutrition is going to take a little bit longer to get that buy-in, by having those, smaller things, and having that communication to be able to see, long-term results, and it's kind of a reframing of their mindset around it, by explaining that feedback loop and those sorts of things, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I think that you find ways that helps the lifter stick to it, right? Like some people are really like, I would say like they are more keen to know about the process, right? They like certain people, like I don't want to tell, I don't need to know how much what the rate of muscle protein synthesis is when I consume X amount of protein and how much leucine triggers that. But some people, they want to know that, So I think it's really understanding what drives the person, what makes them tick, what motivates them, right? And essentially you find the best strategies to keep them, keep that spark or keep that flame burning, right? Before they start seeing the results. And once they start seeing the results, right, then that flame will burn slightly brighter, and then they can sort of like go on for slightly longer period. Because when you first start working with people, you're often trying to build rapport before the results come, So you have the rapport portion, right? And when you start building that rapport, then when the results come, then they will have greater buy-in, right? And then hopefully the cycle continues.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's the thing, you need to get that buy-in, because you kind of touched on it at the start of, there's when it comes to nutrition, it's not necessarily seen as having that feedback from there. So it's just a case of, I know I can just speak to a nutritionist and I just need to do this, a little bit like what you mentioned about, sometimes the male lifters, just eating everything and then being like, right, fix this, whereas it isn't always the case, that because of that feedback loop, which I think is really interesting. With those things about trying to patch things up and the shorter term solutions rather than that buy-in and long term success, how what's the time frame in terms of either seeing an increase in performance, or what's the shelf life of just trying to patch things over before performance actually starts being hindered?
Yeah, I think that you kind of evaluate, like you always look at the low hanging fruit. I think that I have this reputation within certain circles that I'm the guy that tells powerlifters to eat their fruits and vegetables, right? Because I'm basically telling them what their mom or their grandma would tell them. Because a lot of like powerlifters, they don't really do that. They don't really place an emphasis on that, right? So I mean, a lot of them say, oh, if it fits your macros, right, that's fine, right? And while I think that the movement of if it fits your macros, right, was birth out of bodybuilding, like you don't have to be so restricted. But the thing with bodybuilding is that while you fit your macros, because when it comes to bodybuilding, you're actually dieting to a point where you're just so hungry all the time, and you basically have to eat food that will fill you up, that has low amount of calories, because you're just like trying to essentially get super shredded, right? And then you have to eat a lot of vegetables. It's just the secondary it's like a secondary impact, right, of bodybuilding, you have to eat vegetables. But when it comes to powerlifting, right, most of them don't even get shredded. So they just say, oh, as long as I hit my macros, I'm fine. They don't eat any form of fruits and vegetables, right? So I think that finding like low-hanging fruits like that, pun not intended, will actually create something really, really positive. Obviously, if you find certain like deficiencies, like, oh, if it's in the winter month, right, or you don't go out, you don't get much sunlight, right, there are things like vitamin D, right, you can try to supplement with all of that kind of stuff, right? If you're a female, right, and you don't really consume high amounts of red meat, right, you can find ways to like maybe increase your iron intake. I think for most people, creatine would actually work really well. So these are really, really short-term things where you can actually like start to like patch things up, right? Usually, for the most part, you start feeling things within like a month, right? But I think that is kind of like the low-hanging fruit. But however, when it comes to macronutrient changes, I think that it just really depends on what phase of training you're in, right? Whether and what the goals are, whether this person's goal is to gain weight, whether this person's goal is to lose weight. So I think that the most important thing is to when you're trying to gain weight, you're essentially trying to help them not gain weight too quickly, right? For the sake of gaining weight, right? But when it comes to lose weight, then you have to kind of like manage training performance, right? You're having a deficit, but you're trying to manage their performance. And most of the time, what I do is that I say that, okay, cool, right? This first week, you're going to do everything like how you normally do. Imagine you don't have a coach, right? And I'm just going to observe your week one, and then we use that as a baseline, right? And if your baseline is great, we want to see if we can extend that baseline as long as we can. If it's poor, let's try to improve it as much as we can. So it's really hard to pinpoint a specific time frame that I can confidently say, okay, cool, this is how long it will take you. But I would say that if it comes to absolute like weight gain and weight loss rates, right, I can tell you roughly, right, this is the amount of weight you will lose, right? And then and why we're losing this amount of weight at this rate is because we have X amount of time. And during this time, let's monitor how you feel closely, right? And see whether we can either, like say, mitigate any form of performance decrement, or, if you're trying to gain weight, whether we can kind of like manage the rate of weight gain. Because I think when someone who's trying to gain weight, most of the time, they have really probably been cutting for long periods of time, being in a deficit, and then they can no longer like sustain the deficit, right? So there's that tendency to overcompensate and just eat everything in sight in the next like six weeks, right? And then the weight gain can be really, really quickly. Weight gain can happen really quickly. So it's kind of like managing that. I think that when it comes to weight gain or weight loss, there's always something to manage, right? And depending on how the lifter responds, and often you find that out through communication, then that would kind of like determine the time frame for certain benefits to be seen.
Yeah, I think with that, because everyone always wants to know, a time frame of when this is going to happen, or what, when are they going to see what they want to see. But it's got to be that thing of how much weight do they need to lose, how much weight do they need to gain, and also like what you mentioned about when working with people, you need time frame to actually see their eating habits, how are they going to actually work, so you can give suggestions or recommendations. Moving on from the nutrition side of things, because we've spoken there about nutrition feedback isn't really immediate, but in terms of the training side of things, you can get immediate feedback from that and actually see if things are going well or not so well in quicker periods of time. And I know obviously from listening to the RTS podcast, I had a lot of conversation with Mike Teixeira about this. Just wanted to kind of touch on your thoughts in terms of specificity around powerlifting, and is it a case of that it's not always having to be really specific? Is there a carryover from other things that can actually still improve performance? Because why I ask that is the entry point to get involved in powerlifting, because it's especially this year having a bit of a boom in terms of powerlifting, like the world, the most lifters that had attended there. Is it a case of sometimes you can think that it can be too specific, which can sometimes maybe be a little bit of a hindrance, because it's the only sport where the training actually matches the performance, if you like.
Yeah. I think the first question we ask is that why specificity, right? So like, why are we placing such an emphasis on specificity? It's because we think, right, and I'm not saying that this is a false assumption, right, but maybe like it's intuitive to say that if the more you practice something, right, you increase increase the probability of doing that thing well, right? It's like doing the same task over and over again, right? So by doing an exercise that's really specific, right, you increase the chances of you performing that specific exercise well on competition. So we kind of have that assumption. Obviously, you have certain principles, right, of strength training, right? But I think that it's not as straightforward as that, right? Because if we look at a lift, right, and we reduce them down to its parts, right? So you have the movement, then you have the joint angle, right? You have the tempo of the movement, right? And then beyond that, if you go really deep down, you have the contraction, right? And then from the contraction, you have the firing of certain motor neurons and the nervous system, right? So at the end of the day, is that if we reduce all the way back down, right, you have the skill practice, and then all the way at the bottom layer is the ability of your nervous system to fire, right? And I think when it comes to that, right, this, like, if we are seeking certain specific adaptations, right, we can actually say that what would result in this adaptation isn't so narrow, right? It's actually broader than we think, because I'm not seeking a specific exercise, right? I'm assuming, right, that doing a specific exercise will lead to better outcome. But there's also a probability, if that is the case, and if that is like a truism, like it's true in every single case, I should just squat like every 5 minutes, like for the rest of, like, every day, 5 minutes on and off. Because yeah, you're doing the same thing over and over again as much as you can. But we know that would probably not lead to good outcomes, because there are other factors that prevents that expression of strength. Things like fatigue, things like injuries, things like motivation and boredom, right? All of these are confounding factors that will actually prevent the expression of that so-called specific strength on the platform. So I spoke to Mike T about this, because on his podcast, which was your listeners can go back and listen to that specific episode on RTS. But the whole conversation, like, for me, kind of started also with Mike T when I was just back in the day, I think 2019, in Sweden, where I thought of it from this perspective of, we're not looking at it from a specificity for the sake of specificity. We're looking at it from a point of like transference, right? So how much can we transfer that to the platform, right? And I think that if we look at it from that lens, right, and we kind of like broaden our range of what can result in greater transference on the platform, and that sometimes is managing the fatigue, right? Sometimes managing that boredom, sometimes is managing the risk of injury risk, right, which usually is related to training load. So all of these factors, right, I think that when you factor all of that in, people can look at it from that point of view, that specificity is actually slightly broader or less specific than what people commonly think, and factors as well, that there are multiple things that would go into things. Is how long have you been doing this exercise? How long have you been training, right? Like, if you work with youth athletes, right, the whole long-term athletic development is actually a thing, like you get like young adolescents athletes to play sport, right, instead of doing something really specific. Obviously, people say, oh, you have these Tiger Woods people that just playing golf, but all this, like, these are not the norm, right? They are exception to the rule, right? But for most people, I like the general approach is to say, okay, cool, you do things that are non-specific, right? And then then you build a base, right? And then based on that, you then sort of like do something more specific after. But I think that is kind of like looking at it from perspective of the training age, because if you think about it from a powerlifting point of view, why do you have to do something specific, right, all the time if you're a beginner, when literally anything you do, you make gains,
Yeah.
right? Like, if there's a time where you can make gains doing random stuff, right, being a beginner is one of those times,
Mm-hmm.
So that is kind of like the perspective at the really I would say the infancy of someone's training career, right? That would be like, this is, if you have an opportunity to do this, right, this is the best time to do it. Okay. And then on the far end, when you like coach masters lifters, and like Mike T and the RTS crew, they coach quite a few of masters lifter, because obviously they have Mark Robb there, right? So he is a masters lifter himself. He handles a lot of masters lifters coaching. Non-specific training no longer becomes sort of like, this the best time to do it. It's now probably like, I probably have to do it. It almost become like something necessary, just because you've been doing the same thing for like time and time again. then which means that you accumulated X amount of years in this specific joint angle, you accumulated X amount of years doing this specific like load, right? And doing something none or like less specific, right, could take you out of that movement pattern, right? Maybe perhaps work on certain aspects which are not commonly worked, right? And we know, I'm not saying that if someone doesn't do like non-specific training, they'll get injured, right? But like I said, like we know that predictors of like injury risk increases with like increasing training load, right? But we don't really think about training load from a perspective of like, I don't think using tonnage as a training load is actually a good measure, right? I may be completely wrong, and I mean, if the physiotherapists listen to the podcast, feel free to correct me. I look at it from the perspective of what is the loading and the specific joint angle, right? Because a tonnage of 1,000 kilos, right? If you do like one set of like 5 sets of 2 at 100 kilos, that's like a tonnage of like 1,000 kilos. It's very different, right? On that, if you are squatting with, let's say, you do a plaid squats, right? Like you elevate your heels, narrow stance, and your quads, versus you do like one of those like West Side Barbell, really wide squat, right? With like loading your hip, right? So that load, right, is distributed very differently across muscle groups and joints, which means that if the way I see it, if that training load increases in that specific angle, in that specific joint angle, right, then that muscle group will not be able to tolerate it, and then the injury risk for that particular joint angle increases.
Yeah.
But if you can kind of vary it, right, then potentially you may be able to extend the shelf life of that and prevent or reduce injury risk, right? So that's kind of how I sort of like conceptualize it. Obviously, we don't really know, right, what the literature is, or how accurate certain like training load or predictors is, because obviously you have like people like Tim Gabbett out there that tries to look at the acute and chronic load ratio, but there's also people who kind of like push back against that, and I feel like the human system is just really, really complex. I don't think you can actually pinpoint a specific number, especially when it comes to working with lifters who are really elite, because like I said, first of all, you're working with lifters who probably don't fall within the certain bell curve, within the bell curve, which means that most of the research probably would not 100% extrapolate to those population that were in the studies, right? So you just have to have caution, have certain level of caution, right? Because at the end of the day, if you think about it, right, from this perspective, is that I think that the Hippocratic oath of like, first do no harm really, really strongly applies. And what I'm trying to say is that if you think about specificity, and if we go with the assumption that the lens of the range of specificity is wider than we think, right? And the principle of first do no harm, right? We should probably side with the side that said, okay, let's vary things up, just to be cautious, exhibit certain sense of just to be cautious, just to so that the lifters doesn't get injured, right? So there's a lot, like, obviously there's a lot of assumption that is baked into this, but like I said, if it really is true that we don't necessarily, that the road to gains, right, is not, the only road to gains is not just paved with specificity, and multiple roads can lead to the road of gains, right? Why do you want to take the road with the highest risk? So and the thing is, we often assume that it's fine, this person get injured, he'll come back. But I think that even if we throw out all the acute chronic load literature, we know, right? And I think a lot of researchers and scholars and scientists in the field would say that the greatest predictor of injury risk is previous injury. Like, so if we can prevent that first incident of injury, as long as we can, why not?
Yeah. I think one thing that you were saying there is, when we're saying that the human system is going to be quite complex, I think with all the numbers out there and the data that we can use and all those sorts of things, we can't make people into machines and just be like, well, if you do this number and this number, it's gonna equal this. I think there's got to be a little bit more wiggle room with that. One thing that we were saying, especially when you were talking about sort of transference, and I was lucky enough to have Mike Shearer on the podcast and chatted about this a little bit. Is that why you can maybe see, other tools coming into powerlifting, such as, I know people have experimented with sort of like flywheel training, obviously velocity based training, just some other things, to try and keep the specificity the same, if you like, in terms of the same lifts, but adding in, some different variations so that we can change that loading and training stimulus, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I think that I think like you said, I also have this conversation with Mike T. Something that you mentioned just now is we're not machines, right? So I mean, I just like talking to Mike T. I mean, I'm sure you will agree because he's a fantastic thinker, and he basically like to entertain all my weird thoughts, right? So Mike T, if you're out there, I appreciate you. But we had a conversation. I don't think the podcast episode is out yet, but essentially in that podcast episode, I said that like training and coaching is more like economics rather than physics. Right. So physics is like, you like very binary, like an electron, a proton, this is that, right? If you put two magnet poles of opposite, they'll attract, and you put the same, they'll repel. It's like the results are almost like I said, if we take away all your quantum theory, quantum mechanics, and all that kind of stuff, right? The general laws of physics, right? You can really say for very, very strong certainty. But I don't think humans are like that. The reason why I say is economics is that you have certain laws like governing, right? You need over time progressive overload, right? Fatigue, you need to manage fatigue. And then based on that, you evaluate one really, really strong principle of economics is trade-offs, right? Opportunity cost. You evaluate by doing something, what is the trade-off and what's the benefit, And then you sort of like say, okay, this is the trade-off, this is the benefit. I think in this certain situation, this would be the best way to go about things. And I'm not saying that this will apply like eternally, all like, it's not like a law of gravity, right? But whereas like certain things like, okay, for example, what's the best way to curb inflation? You raise interest rates, right? Maybe like that generally would apply, but certain situations it may not. Sometimes it may backfire and all that kind of stuff. Sometimes you just need to let things run. I'm not an economic expert. I'm just throwing like random stuff out so economists don't get upset. But like I said, that certain things that apply now, that work now, may not work in the future, right? And then you kind of have to always look at balancing the trade-offs, right? While letting those like certain like laws, right, like sort of like guide you, So I think that is the case when it comes to training, which is why I don't think that the law of specificity is not like the law of gravity, which always happens all the time. It's more on like things like it's more, I would say, it's kind of like it's a response, right? It's responding to certain information. Okay, like I think that when it comes, like, I like to use the economics analogy because, like I said, essentially what happens in a market, right, like a free market, is that you get information from the people, right? Supply and demand. What is somebody willing to pay, right? And I think that that's the same thing when it comes to training. You apply certain things, then you get information, and in return use that information to further inform your training, So that's kind of like why I say that training and coaching is more like economics rather than physics. Like I said, this is just an analogy, so there's obviously this analogy or this analogous portions of it, right? But I think that help people conceptualize things. And then like certain tools that you have mentioned, velocity-based training, right? Flywheels, right? A lot of this kind of stuff. Like, I mean, Mike T is the guy that freaking do front squats and still gets super strong, all the time, right? So like while it may not apply to everyone, like I said, that it gives you a certain reason to actually try it, right? So if you look at things from like sort of like probability point of view, is that if everybody that does front squats, if everybody that's strong doesn't do front squats, then you can say that the probability of front squats making you strong is low, right? But but now you add into the equation, there's a strong lifter that does front squats and it's strong. I'm not saying that the probability would greatly immense, but the probability would be higher than zero, So like then you start thinking, okay, cool, maybe I can start using this as a tool. And then when you start applying that, like I said, as a tool in your toolbox, right? In certain specific situations, perhaps it'll work for you, right? And the thing is this, right? Once it works for you, then your probability increases, right? It's kind of like looking at it from like a Bayesian perspective, right? Bayesian's like from a Bayesian's statistics point of view, it's just like, okay, cool. What are your priors, right? So obviously we know that if lifting weights across time, it provides you with strength, right? Doing front squats is lifting weights across time. that means your prior that front squats doesn't increase strength is zero. It's not, sorry, that front squats cannot increase strength is it cannot be zero, because it fits the criteria of certain form of progressive overload. It may not be high, but it's not zero. So if you try it and it works, then obviously with the new evidence that comes in, you update your prior, right? Because if your prior is zero, it's always going to be zero. But we know that it cannot be zero, right? Because it fits certain criteria. But it will be zero if, like, for example, like, we know that putting your head on the computer screen will not help you increase your strength, right? Like, that is like zero. No matter how many times you try it, right, it's still going to be zero. But we know that front squat doesn't, because of it fits certain criteria. And I think that you look at it from the perspective, right? Evaluate tools that are beneficial to you, right? And then next thing, not only do you have the opportunity cost of whether this will benefit you, right? But it's also the opportunity cost of, am I making the best out of my time, and am I making the best out of my resources? Because you mentioned like a flywheel. Flywheel is like really expensive, like most people will not be able to afford it. Even with velocity trackers, this is just a very recent thing, because prior to this, unless you own, like, at the start, people use like a Tendo unit, right? And then I can't remember what's the like the next thing, but that people used before, like they started making like Squat and Science, and then Rep One, and then they have like different companies making velocity tracking devices, right? But that essentially, that is also a factor, right? Like resources, money, right? Those are also certain trade-offs that you have to balance. And at the end of the day, you think of it from perspective is that, cool, certain things may actually work, but at this time point, I don't think that, whether I can afford it in terms of time or resources. Maybe not, but maybe in the future. I do think that, like I said, Mike T is kind of like, he's like the GOAT, right, in this field, right? He has time to play for all this kind of stuff, and he probably enjoys it, doing it as well, experimenting kind of stuff. He's like his own lab, so I think that he can kind of like afford to do all this, but like for some people, that trade-off might not be worth it, right? Maybe for Mike T, or someone who is doing it to fulfill their inquisitive nature when it comes to strength training, right? That trade-off of, okay, maybe I won't get as strong in X amount of time is worth it, because, hey, I find out whether this works or not, But for some people, it's not. Like, I want to gain strength at all costs, right? Then they would tend to try it and not veer out from certain more traditional routes. But the whole conversation about specificity is about, like, hey, right, your route is not just like that. Maybe it's slightly wider, and which means that even if you veer from side to side, you're still on track. Not like if it's not like your route is so small, if you veer to the side, you just fall off completely. So I think that conversation is, in general, I feel that is something that is much more beneficial, because I think it opens the possibilities for people to make progress. You don't have to do things a certain way. And I think that any coach out there that will tell you that if there's only one way to do something, right, and this is the only way, right, I think that those are the coaches you should like run away from, because like, so I think that it also is a factor of, like, if there's only one way and you put a high amount of confidence in that way, right? I feel like people are not willing to deal with certain form of uncertainty, right? But the thing is this, right? Like, human are like biological, we are like really like biological complex, like, I wouldn't even call it systems, but we're like just biological complex creatures, So things like your mood would impact stuff, right? So I think to say that, to make a strong claim that there's only one way to do a certain thing to drive certain adaptation, I think that that's claiming too much, and I don't think that even the research doesn't really back it up. It's like in the podcast with Mike's the podcast episode with Mike, I mentioned certain papers that looked at they basically challenge the notion of specificity. So I think, like, even the research, right, doesn't support that the only way to make really, really good gains is being specific all the time.
Yeah, definitely. I think the best thing, I thought that was a really good explanation, because I think there's a lot of times where coaches are kind of like scared to are a little bit unsure how to experiment with it. And I know obviously, you know, some people are going to have a lot more time than others. But what you're saying there about, you know, having a look at, you know, if everyone did front squat, all right, well, we know that that's not going to work. Whereas actually, you know, when it comes to strength training, other people are trying different things, and obviously there's going to be a skill component to it there as well. And if you're giving it a go, you know, that probability is going to increase, which I think is a good way of looking at it, rather than, you know, trying to avoid it at all costs, rather than just thinking squat, bench, and deadlift. I know I'll just do that. Whereas, you know, there's other factors like what you mentioned in there to take into account, which I you know, I thought was really interesting, and is a topic that I think is needs to be spoken about a little bit to increase that knowledge and just expand that thought process a little bit. I know we've spoken about, you know, the nutrition side of things, the training side of things, and a couple of tangents thrown in there, but for everyone listening, whether they're coaches, whether they're lifters, from everything that we've chatted about today, what would be your take-home points or words of wisdom?
I think the most important thing, like I really, really believe this strongly, and I've spoken about this in my podcast as well, is like, you know, like epistemic humility, right? You know, when we even, like I said, people like to make strong claims, you know, and a lot of times the polarizing claims that are strong usually get the views, right? I think that people just don't like to mull in like uncertainty or say that I don't know, or even being challenged, right? I'm fine with like making certain statements, but like I said, you know, I'm not an economist, I'm not a physio, right? Anybody want to challenge whatever I say, by all means go ahead, because like I say, I might be wrong, you know, and if I'm wrong, I want to know, you know. So like just having that sense of humility, right, is actually very, very important. And I think that looking at things from, instead of looking at it from a point of view of certainty, right, looking at it from a perspective of probability, right, is actually very, very useful for people who are practitioners, right? I've been thinking about this thought, obviously being in academia, doing PhD, right? We use like a frequentist model of statistics, right? We use p-values, right? But I feel that when it comes to actual applied work, like I feel like a Bayesian model would actually be much better. And I know there's all those hardcore frequentists out there, frequentists, that's people that would hate me. But like, I mean, at the end of the day, first of all, we have the research doesn't really, like I said, doesn't apply to most lifters, because the people that we work with, if they're elite, they fall out of their bell curve, right? But that doesn't mean we can say that, okay, cool, if this like this person is, and if we use frequentist models, right, we always say like, okay, we have this hierarchy of evidence, right, meta-analysis, right, the lowest is case studies. But if we use a Bayesian model that looks at probability, a case study that is very similar to the lifter that you coach is actually stronger evidence, right, than a meta-analysis of a general population. Because if the lifter that you coach is an outlier, right, because by definition, if we look at people who like the population that most research has, they are not elite lifters. By definition, you would exclude the elite lifter. But if the case study is an elite lifter, n equals 1, and if you use a Bayesian model, right, that is probably a little bit closer, right? So whatever that worked for this lifter in that case study is more probable than not for the lifter that you might be coaching. So like I said, instead of saying, oh, you know, I read this study, right, all right, p value is more than more than a certain amount, right, and you know the effect size is like moderate, right, this must work, right? But I feel like, you know, when you apply it and you just say, okay, cool, we have some evidence, right, so we know that it's not zero, right, but let's just see how probable it is, right? And if it doesn't, we just adjust, and we just keep adjusting. And I think that when it comes to coaching, but to do that, you always have to be in the point of like understanding there's always that certain level of uncertainty there that you have to deal with. And some people, it may not be comfortable for them, you know, but I think that you have to be comfortable with it, right? You know, I think if we really just go back, I think words of wisdom, it's I don't really, I mean, I'm not sharing anything that's groundbreaking. I think that even when you go back in the days, like looking at like history of philosophy, right? Like Descartes said that the only thing can be certain is like he exists, right? So like there's always people about like skeptics, you know, and then like he said, you know, like I think therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, right? This kind of stuff, right? So like since the dawn of time, like people, like great thinkers have always dealt with certain form of uncertainty. But right now, I think that we come. I'm not saying we, as I don't want to speak for everyone, but I say like the more we progress, right, we feel like we know a lot of things, right? Obviously, with the progress of science and all that kind of stuff, like science and innovation, the expansion of the internet, allows people to communicate and all that kind of stuff, right? But I think that there is always going to be like certain form some uncertainty that people have to deal with, and I think that having that epistemic humility, right? Epistemic humility meaning that epistemic is basically episteme is like knowledge, right? Like knowing what is knowledge, right? Having the humility sometimes is very, very useful, because I think that the minute you say that you know, they always say that if you think you're the smartest person in the room, right, you're probably you're definitely like in the wrong room, right? Or you're just blindsided by yourself. So I think knowing what you know, right, and how strong those claims are, it's going to be very important. I think that you can, in summary, right, I tend to ramble quite a lot, but in summary is that you have strong opinions, but hold them loosely, meaning that when new evidence come up, don't hesitate to change, right? Or even the thing is this, right? You don't even have to change it, but don't shy away from being challenged. Because personally, I think that if someone disagrees with me, right, and we go back and forth, right, and we have obviously a productive disagreement, right, we can find something that is better. It's like iron sharpening iron. We find something, and who knows, we may find a solution together, right? Because but the thing is that you have to kind of have that humility to say that you don't know everything. Because if you think that you know every single thing, and if someone disagrees with you, the person is either dumb or ignorant, right? If you think really know everything, and then you come from a position of you don't even have charity, like you're not coming from a position of charity, so the conversation won't be productive at all. And the same thing goes for the other party, right? If both parties who disagree come in with a position that there's something that I'm not seeing here, and me disagreeing with you is trying to find out what is that thing that either of us are not seeing, I think that is much more productive conversation to be had. Whether that's whatever, I don't know, like obviously now it's related to strength training and nutrition, but I just think that this kind of like applies to almost like all areas. So yeah, I would say that is probably what the words of wisdom. You can have strong opinions, but hold them loosely, especially in light of new evidence.
Yeah, definitely. I think there was a couple of good points in there, and one thing that kind of stuck out for me was that finding solutions to things, and iron sharpening iron. I think it's a case of we all want our lifters to get stronger. We all want to find the best way of doing things so that we can more talking about the powerlifting side of things to see how strong people can get. And it's kind of that thing of there's nothing wrong with being wrong or being open to change. Because one thing that was stuck in my head there is Einstein's definition of madness, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Like, you've got to be adaptable, and what's that, is it Bruce Lee, would it be like water, be adaptable? Yep. Like, I think it's a good mentality to have, or else a couple of times we mentioned in the podcast there, getting buy-in. You're not going to get by. You'll soon not get buy-in if you're not getting the results as a coach. And but that goes the same for a lifter as well. You've got to be open to trying different things, to see if it might work. Thanks a lot, Kedric, for taking time to jump on. We're really, really looking forward to this episode and picking your brains about this, because, like I say, I enjoyed listening to you on the RTS podcast. It's been great to catch up, and I think it's a really interesting topic to dive into. If anyone's got any questions about what we've chatted about today, want to see the content that you put out there, or even work with yourself, where could people reach out to you or find you?
Yep. So the best way to reach out to contact me is my Instagram, right? Kedric.reformance. Alternatively, if you want to work with us, right? I mean, like, Reformance is not just Alfred and myself. We have a number of other capable coaches, right? You can always message the Reformance Instagram, Reformance Training, right? And yeah, I think other than that, the best way to reach me is from Instagram, Kedric.reformance, or my email is kedric@reformancetraining.com. So yeah, like I said, feel free to have any questions. If there are any points that I share that's unclear or maybe too rambly and people want some clarification, feel free to reach out. Or even if you disagree with things I say and you want to facilitate the conversation, feel free to reach out. I cannot guarantee that I will always respond on time, just because I'm like I said, busy with travels and trying to finish up my PhD. But I do try to get back to most of the messages.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot for taking the time to jump on. Like I say, it's been awesome catching up with you. It's been awesome having the chat with you today. Thanks a lot to everyone listening, and I will see you all next week.
Right. Thank you for having me.